So my name is Maybelline Gamboa. I am a VPR fellow, and I am also a PhD candidate in the graduate degree program in ecology here at CSU. And as a graduate student, we're often tasked with trying to distill our research into a few sentences and create a story that's really impactful, that's translatable across a number of different platforms. And that sounds really difficult, and it is. And so I was pleased to find out that I would be introducing somebody who's an expertise in this area and actually explores digital storytelling. His name is Dr. Michael Humphrey. He is an assistant professor here at CSU in the Journalism and Media Communication Department. And as I mentioned before, his concentration is in digital storytelling. Now, he got his BA at William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri, and then he worked for a number of years in journalism. Before that, or after that, rather, in 2010, he moved to NYU and got his master's there. And then he moved from the Big Apple to Choice City here in Colorado. And he earned his PhD here in the Public Communication and Technology Department, working with Dr. Patrick Plaisance, who is now at UPenn. And although his advisor has moved, we have been lucky enough to keep him around. And so his research actually explores the interaction of how individuals tell stories through social media. And I'm really excited to hear his talk today. I believe it's about his experience working with Adobe and other companies, trying to incorporate virtual reality. So without further ado, here is Dr. Michael Humphrey.
That was great. That was such a good introduction by Maybelline, seriously. So accurate and depth, so much depth there. I just love that. By the way, somebody intercepted a Snapchat earlier today from a student who knows me. Apparently took a picture of me somewhere on campus and said, Dr. Humphrey is wearing a suit. I never thought I would see the day. So you've elevated me from a persona level right here on campus. I appreciate that. So as Maybelline was saying, my research is really in digital storytelling. I think about it in a lot of different ways. I think about it partially in how we define what stories are and partially how digital media starts to change our perception of what a story is. That didn't necessarily force me to think about virtual reality, but I did start thinking about it because one of the other things I do on the side is write about technology and entertainment for Forbes. And a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to think about what Adobe was doing in terms of virtual and augmented reality. And that's really where a lot of my presentation is going to focus, although some of it will also focus on what I did for my PhD. And part of that is this. When you start to do the reading in what digital storytelling meant, and I mean several years before the web existed, one of the big questions that a lot of the theorists were working on is when you move into a digital realm, are we talking about a space or are we talking about a page? Now, this was also, these ideas were being considered at a time when virtual reality was also being considered. So it's not like it was, predicting the future. They already thought about what virtual reality might look like. But the question was an important one because it was asking about our control as storytellers and what other participants, what role they play as either part of the story, changing the story, or feeling like they get to navigate the story in their own ways. And so I'll tell you, from that point, which was a great question, to today, many of the storytellers have struggled with making a lot of progress from that point because there are three fallacies in the text story adoption in general that a lot of people have fallen into and made a lot of interesting projects out of, but also projects that didn't really touch very closely to what audience desire eventually told us they had. And one of them was this idea that every time there was a new digital platform, we could simply migrate the idea of what we did before. The New York Times I was just talking to Caden about this earlier. After 3 years of sort of doubting that the World Wide Web would exist, decided to finally put up a web page. And when they introduced the web page, their publisher at the time, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., said, our site is designed to take full advantage of the evolving capabilities offered by the internet, which just wasn't true. But then made this fallacy that we see our role on the web as being similar to our traditional print role. And for 20 years, you've seen that not just the New York Times, and it's certainly not their fault. This has been true across the field I belong to. We often saw the internet as a super newspaper, or if you worked on TV in journalism, then you saw it as a super TV journalism. If you worked in radio, you thought of it as super radio. And none of that turned out to be very accurate. And now they're starting to figure some of that out, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. The next fallacy is this idea that we could somehow get audiences to lean middle. And what I mean by that is in most storytelling, we're either used to leaning back and letting the storyteller take control of our mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, or we're used to being highly involved, and that's largely in gaming and other kinds of interactive experiences like that. There's this idea that we as storytellers can keep control but still get the audience to do certain things for us. And I see this fallacy reappear over and over and over, that there is some lean middle place that the audience wants to be and have experiences that are meaningful for them. I'm not saying it could never happen, but it certainly hasn't happened most of the time that people have tried that. And so an example of this was YouTube. When they created their platform, they thought of what they thought YouTube could be as a dating site. They saw that as an obvious choice. Like let's make a dating site out of YouTube. And what they eventually found was that they needed to let the people who wanted to create in their space just go and do whatever those people wanted to do. And of course, that created things like vlogging, which actually did take off. And it's one of the things I wrote about for 6 years for Forbes, where I talked to vloggers who often felt like they were in tension with YouTube as a platform because YouTube always wanted it to be a higher end kind of content, and the vloggers realized it was more of a social content, and it took Google, who bought it fairly quickly for a lot of money, to realize they had a very large social media, something that they didn't realize when they created Google Plus because they wanted a social media. They already had one on their hands. And a lot of times that idea that we can tell you how to use these platforms can create problems, even though YouTube is doing fine. And then a wow as experience. The idea, and this is where I think we really touch base with virtual and augmented reality. The idea that if I can blow your mind with the technology, we've done our job. And that works for a while. And so when you talk to people who own VR headsets and you ask them about their experience with them, a lot of them will say, oh man, the first several weeks, I just used it all the time. And I was in there all the time exploring those worlds. And you ask them a follow-up question. How much do you use it now? I don't know if I've used it in the past month, the past 2 months. It's kind of sitting there. It's sort of like gym equipment that you buy for the home. After a while, it gets harder and harder to use. And also the studies that this idea that the wow would create these psychological states. Julie Kroner, who researches users of virtual reality, showed this video, a 360 video of Syrian refugees to people across different age ranges, and one of the respondents basically horrified her, in her words, by saying it was nice to see that they did normal stuff like playing soccer and having a family dinner in their tent and going to school. It didn't seem that different from my life. I guarantee you that was not the point of making the video about a Syrian refugee camp. And so the idea that we can shock you somehow into being empathetic, for instance, or to understanding another world just because you're there is another potential fallacy. So in 2017, to understand this better, I went out to Adobe and started talking to their research and development team. They seemed like a very interesting way to look at this question because they were trying at the time to create software for creators that would fit both an augmented and virtual reality. And because they are good at what they do in many ways, I had a sense, and they were more than happy to share with me that they were working with creators and working with what they were thinking they could do in these spaces and how to build software for them. And that's exactly what happened. So including talking to Adobe's engineers, I also talked to a lot of the creators who they worked with in creating some of the early entertainment in virtual reality specifically. And one of the things that I learned was that Adobe itself was a little bit skeptical that this would work, that especially in VR, whether storytelling would work very well in that space or not. And so Gavin Miller, who is a very fun person to talk to, just in a quick aside, his hobby is to create robotic snakes, which are fascinating to watch, even though I completely hate snakes. And so that's what he does for his fun. He thinks about this very deeply, and we had many good conversations about where he saw storytelling and virtual reality going. And he made the point that I think was very trenchant, that there have to be devices for consuming that's an order of magnitude better than traditional media, because traditional media is so good at telling stories. And so that's the challenge they were willing to take on and pour a lot of money and time into helping creators create in ways that would be that magnitude better. So what did I learn? Basically, these are some concepts that I just want to share with you that Adobe was starting to figure out at the time that I was there at the research facility. One is, a lot of times when you talk to writers, videographers, even podcast creators, there's the idea that we frame the story as an important part of the way we see our product. You know, what we end up doing is we actually give you the border around, in which you will have the experience. And of course, when you put somebody into a virtual reality headset, that completely changes that dynamic. Because I have, at the very least, 3 degrees of freedom, right? I can look up, I can look around, I can look down. And because of that, I may not always be looking in the place that you want me to look when you're telling a story. Adobe thinks of this as, instead of deciding the frame for the viewer, you start at true north, meaning that you can, almost every time you create a video, start somebody looking in one direction. And if you think about true north as an orientation in which the audience could always refer back somehow, and the more subtle, the better, either using things like visual cues, some of which are quite ham-handed if you watch much of this storytelling, things like arrows and words like "look over here," which does not feel like a full immersive experience, but more subtle cues. Like, one of the things the creators kept telling me over and over is, if I can perfect the direction of sound as it meets the ear of the person in the headset, I will be able to imply that they should look somewhere. And once I can imply that, it will feel like the most natural thing in the world, that if I heard this, I would look there. And now what our job is no longer is to frame the story, but to gain attention in particular places. And so the storyteller has to think about, instead of immersing somebody into the story itself, they do that, plus always move the attention where you want it to, so that it feels like a virtual experience that's more implicit than explicit. And so the concept of true north is a good thing for storytellers to be thinking about. Also, Gavin believed that there was a tension between probably the most important thing we do as storytellers and the VR headset. If you've ever studied narrative as a sort of social science, you will know that transportation turns out to be one of the most important effects that's created by telling a story. And basically what transportation is a sort of willing forgetfulness on the audience's part to where they are into the world in which the main character is. And so you start to see the world through the main character. And this, of course, creates a sense of empathy that has been studied and measured that can actually do amazing things in discourse in our community. For instance, there have been studies that show that somebody who is highly opposed in a topic if they can see the topic by being transported through the eyes of a main character who's showing a different point of view, you are less likely to build your counter-argument mind up during those times because you are empathizing with the main characters. That's a big deal. Partially, by the way, a lot of that research was done right here at CSU in the journalism department. Some of the early work in that. Gavin believes that transportation and immersion sort of fight each other because in one sense, when you are being transported, you are willingly moving your mind into another place. But as we've heard already today several times, virtual reality is its own space already. So we're already one step removed from the space we are technically and physically into an immersive world. And he believes that that is causing a conflict for transportation. This was touched on very briefly earlier a couple times. This summer, I spent a lot of time in between writing a book in the VR headset looking at a lot of different things. And one of the things I learned sort of a couple weeks later were that all my geolocated memories were in the virtual space, not in the space I actually had the headset on. So when I was remembering something, I was remembering the virtual place was connecting to that instead of the physical place I was in. And that is extraordinary to think about. And I think it's what Gavin's talking about. We've already been moved once. Can we be moved again? And is this a conflict? So one of the things, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But let me move on to one other thing. The idea might be, and Adobe thinks this, and I kind of think this as well, that in the past, the storyteller has largely been thinking in terms of creating storylines. And these storylines can be one-offs, one movie, one newspaper article, one podcast, a storyline that has a beginning, middle, and end. They can also extend several times over, like the series like The Hunger Games is a good example of that, where the storyline continues over several narrative arcs. But if we think that way, we are thinking in terms of sort of triggering transportation. Like that's the reason to create a storyline. On the other hand, if you think about interactivity and immersion as being the two most important dynamics of virtual reality, you might think instead about story worlding, which becomes less and less linear and more nonlinear. Experiences that you can have where you are sort of jumping into different scenarios. Storytellers have been doing this for years. My wife and I once went to a play in New York City that was on a boat. And once you walked on the boat, there are several different rooms on the boat, both below and above deck, would trigger as soon as audience would walk in. The actors would start conducting that part of the play. And as you walked around in any order you wanted, you started to stitch the story world together and understand what was connecting and what was having influence on each other so that the story started to work in a nonlinear way and creating a sense of immersion rather than transportation. And that story worlding can be very interesting. One of the applications I've noticed, probably the most effective story that's been told in virtual space so far actually happened on a social media site called VR Chat. There are social media sites in virtual reality, by the way. I don't know if any of you have been in them, but they are scary. I just want you to know that, because as soon as you transport in, it's sort of like landing on the glass table, except you're landing in mixer parties, which to me are the worst thing you could land in anyway. So this is a little bit of my own bias, but you hear voices, like real human voices, attached to avatars. It took me a while to get used to them. I'm starting to get used to them. I feel like I need to study them, and I found a couple that I actually like, including one where you sit down in a theater and you're watching something. Like I watched an opera with other avatars in the theater seats. You could look around and see who else was there. When you popped in, there was a moderator, basically, who was sitting next to you. And he was a big fan of opera and sort of an expert in opera. And so he would tell you what the opera was about as you sat there and watched together. And you could ask questions and say, when was this? And he would have the answers for them. And that's really where social media starts to take off. He was kind of like an influencer trying to get more people to love opera while we watched opera on a screen. That was the social media I could get with. The mixers were not very interesting to me. But What VR chat is more like a mixer, and two people came up with the idea of creating two personas. One was Chips, and the other was Nuts. That was the name. And they fall in love in a 10-episode series on VR chat in real time that you could watch. You would be invited to come into the space, and you could watch the drama play out. It ended. The 10th episode was a wedding. In which one of the bridesmaids, for instance, decided to slither up the aisle as a snake and then become their usual avatar. Very interesting. The voice of Morgan Freeman married them. There's all kinds of very weird, strange things. But it was very effective. And I read that tens of thousands of people were there in the virtual room watching it. So it's more like theater again. It's probably more like that boat than it is like what you would normally watch on Netflix, because that story could change in different places and different times. So with all that in mind, here are my final thoughts as to what we're going to think about as we go into storytelling in virtual reality, which Adobe believes, and so do I, that it is a real possibility and it can be a very, very powerful thing. First of all, that we are in a demassified and a continually growing demassification of media. So the idea that VR is coming along and might tell stories doesn't mean Netflix is going to die. Not many things have died, if you think about it. There's still newspapers landing. That may not always be true, but there's still newspapers landing on your stoop. There's still radio out there. Demassification is the more predictable thing about media in general. And so learning how to create multiverses of stories that hit many different places, or what we often refer to in our department as transmedia. Danny Castillo, one of my colleagues sitting over here, teaches the transmedia class right now to help people understand what story do you need for which space. Plus the need for, and Caden touched on this, either AI or some kind of game machining to create story worlds for immersive moments that you skip around to until you have a sense of an entire world. And then also, very important part of this is social presence, meaning that the persona in these places probably will matter more in the future than the media that we're using, so that we connect to people and places that feel like part of the story instead of just the technology itself, which leads to the idea that we should be creating stories that answer the question, why did you tell that story, instead of, wow, you told that story. Thank you very much.